Welcome to the Nervous System Care and Healing Podcast, where we talk about how to take care of ourselves in mind, in body, in spirit, while we navigate systems that were designed to keep us dysregulated. I'm your host, Liz, a neurodivergent therapist of color, and I'm really glad that you're here. Hi, everybody. Today, I want to discuss a modality that I use in my counseling practice and that I have found to be personally very helpful for myself as well. So I'm filming this episode to share a hopefully simple and straightforward explanation of what is brain spotting and what can it help with. So whether you are considering receiving brain spotting therapy for yourself, or you're a practitioner who's considering getting trained and integrating this modality into your practice, I hope this episode is helpful for you. So let's start with what is brain spotting. It is a healing modality that works directly with the brain and the nervous system. And it was developed by a psychologist named David Grand in the early 2000s. And today it is used worldwide by thousands of therapists, coaches, and healing practitioners. And something I've enjoyed about the brain spotting community is that it is quite international, multicultural. There are trainings that happen across the globe, even in different languages. So I find that to be really cool. And the basic idea behind brain spotting is that where you look affects how you feel. In other words, the eye position, the point in space that you are looking at right now, is impacting which areas of the brain are being activated. And your eye position impacts what is happening in your nervous system and how you feel inside, even if you don't consciously notice that all right now. So the easiest way to demonstrate this is through an example. So I want you to notice, where do your eyes look when I ask you, what did you eat for dinner last night? So if I were to answer that question for myself, I notice my eyes look to my top right, and I start to think about the tacos that I ate for dinner last night and how they tasted and all that. So that tells me that I have a brain spot in my top right corner of my visual field that correlates with the memory and the emotions of the dinner I ate last night. As another example, notice where your eyes naturally go when I ask you, what is your favorite color? Your eyes probably looked somewhere, or maybe they stayed in the same spot you were looking. But either way, that tells us something about the brain spot associated with your awareness of your favorite color. And then, if you were to move your gaze noticeably in one direction, so maybe you move your gaze all the way to the right, then you might notice that even that spot feels a bit different. Or if you move your eyes all the way upward so that you're almost looking up at the ceiling or up at the sky, you'll probably notice that that feels different as well. So that is an example of just how many brain spots there are. And we're just demonstrating this point that where you look is connected to how you feel. When I first got trained in brain spotting, I realized, as did many others, I'm sure, that I accidentally brain spot all the time because I'm a person who tends to zone out and go really deep in thought. And then before I know it, I realize I've been staring at a wall for 2 minutes. I'm thinking or mulling over something. I'm just letting my gaze land wherever it wants to land. And then there's important processing that's happening in my mind, in my body, while I'm seemingly zoned out or deep in thought. And what we're doing when we're in a brain spotting session is we are making conscious a process that is usually unconscious, because most of us aren't consciously aware of when we're zoning out and staring off at a wall. But with brain spotting, we actually bring focused attention, mindful awareness to that specific visual point in space that we're looking at. And from that place of focused attention, sustained across a few minutes or several minutes, the brain and the nervous system are able to process information in a way that can feel healing, relieving, or clarifying. So I'm going to shift to a semi-scientific explanation here to really outline what it is that Brainspotting is doing that other modalities aren't. For example, in traditional talk therapy, we're accessing the talking parts of the brain and the thinking, cognitive, intellectual parts of ourselves. We're working with the prefrontal cortex in most traditional talk therapy formats. And that's why some people feel like they end up talking in circles and becoming really cognitive aware of the different issues in their life, but not actually feeling significantly different. And that's because they are staying at the level of the conscious cognitive mind. Whereas with brain spotting, we are accessing the deeper parts of the brain, the subcortical brain, where more unconscious information is stored. And some of that unconscious information might include the unprocessed experiences of stress or trauma that get held in the nervous system because we didn't have the opportunity to process those experiences when they actually happened. So with brain spotting, I think of it as opening a different door, going down a different path within ourselves that we might not be able to access through just talking. I want to be clear here that I don't think there's anything wrong with talk therapy or talking in therapy. In fact, I think it can be incredibly helpful for building trust and connection and rapport and safety in the healing process and in the therapeutic relationship. Because if we feel like we can't even have a conversation with our practitioners that feels safe and connected, then it's going to be super hard to actually feel safe enough to go inward and go deep through brain spotting as well. So talking does play a role in processing. Our main point is that we're not only going to talk. So if you do reach a point where you want to go deeper than verbalizing or trying to describe your experience with words, that is where brain spotting can help bridge the gap. And in a brain spotting session, I've noticed that, speaking for myself, if I'm talking while I'm processing through brain spotting, I'm actually talking from a different part of my brain. It's less about making sense and telling a linear story that is logical, and it's more about verbalizing a stream of consciousness and naming things as they're coming up. So that's all to say that talking can play a role in the processing. So now that I've shared how brain spotting works, I want to get into what a session might look or feel like. Of course, every session, every brain spotting experience is unique to each person. There's no one way that it'll look. But the general structure is that we might start off by talking about a certain theme or debriefing maybe the events of the past week or past month. And then somewhere in the session, someone might want to shift from talking and verbalizing to maybe doing some brain spotting processing around this theme. So then I, as the practitioner, might help them find a brain spot that connects them with the experience that they want to process. I might bring in a pointer, like a physical pointer, into the session. And for an online brain spotting session, I would slowly move that pointer across the screen from left to right or from right to left, and then just have the person track the pointer with their eyes. And then when or if they find a spot where they feel something or their nervous system starts to have a reaction or starts to feel some kind of activation or a heightened emotion, then we might pause at that spot and note it as a possible brain spot. You know, we always have choice in the process. Just because something is happening at a certain brain spot doesn't mean we have to stay there and process on that spot. We can also choose to move away from that spot and toward maybe something that feels more resourcing. Because in each of our visual fields, there are certain areas that feel good to look at and other areas that feel harder to look at just because of the way that our brains are wired and our nervous systems are organized and how certain memories have been encoded and stored in our brain body systems. And so with every brain spotting session, with each moment of the process, there is always choice of whether you want to find a brain spot that connects you to a resource in your nervous system, something that feels good, or whether you want to work with a spot that brings up some activation, maybe even a lot of activation, but it actually feels important to stay there because the more you process on that spot and practice mindful awareness, the more that experience is released, the more that tension lifts. What I'll always remind folks in a brain spotting session is that there's nothing we need to make happen. We are simply noticing the process. We are not forcing anything. We're not saying, okay, well, we found a brain spot, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now we have to fix all of the stress and the trauma associated with it. No, we're just saying, here's a spot. We're going to notice what happens here, and we're going to let the body and the brain do whatever they need to do to process. The thing about emotions and sensations in the body is that they actually respond to being noticed, right? There's a difference between when I feel anger and I actually mindfully notice that I feel anger versus when I feel anger and I try to ignore it. With brain spotting, we are doing the former. We are feeling the feelings and we're mindfully noticing it. And what that does is it changes our relationship to the experience. So instead of being consumed by grief, instead you can be in relationship with grief through the brain spot that you're processing on. Instead of being completely overwhelmed by anger, you can instead be an observer of how anger shows up in your nervous system. With most emotions, once they're noticed and tended to, they actually move and they shift and they change form. They get unstuck. So that's the process that we are tapping into when we do brain spotting. I will also name that a huge component of the healing in this process is the attunement between nervous systems. It is the human relationship between the practitioner and the recipient of the brain spotting. So this isn't some kind of manualized process where we can just reduce brain spotting to like holding a pointer up in space and saying, look here. Like that is technically what is happening sometimes, but also the more maybe invisible part of the work is this energy flow between two human nervous systems that allows for co-regulation. You know, when one nervous system takes a breath and exhales, the other nervous system maybe can take a deeper exhale as well. When two or more humans share space and time together, there's something happening in the space between them to create healing, to create breathing room for processing to happen. So brain spotting is the opposite of rushing through a process. It's the opposite of trying to fix something through brute force. It is the opposite of talking and theorizing about things. It is often quite nonverbal. It can feel very powerful and even sacred to participate in a brain spotting experience. And sometimes it can just feel like a really nice exhale and permission to take a deep sigh and a deep breath after holding your breath for really long. You know, in terms of some of my personal experiences as a recipient of brain spotting, I can say too that it's been a spiritual experience for me. It's connected me with ancestral presences, even when I wasn't expecting to. In some ways, brain spotting has felt like a psychedelic experience for me. In the sense that, you know, my sensory experience shifted, my sense of time shifted. It seemed like no time had passed, or maybe a couple minutes, but it had actually been several minutes or even 30 minutes. And to reiterate, I also did feel fully in my autonomy and in control the whole time. It's not like I was being hypnotized or, you know, forced to go somewhere internally against my will. But I just wanted to highlight that brain spotting can really open up a different state of consciousness, and that can be profoundly healing for folks as well. I still remember the first time I was introduced to brain spotting, and it was actually in a coaching session. I remember saying after a few minutes of staring at the pointer that my coach was holding up, I said, it kind of feels like stargazing, because the state of awareness and the mindful attention of just looking at a dot on the screen reminded me of how I would feel when I would look up at the sky and stare at a dot, a sparkling light dot of light in the sky. Since then, I've had, a series of different trainings and personal experience with brain spotting, and then bringing it into my practice to support the clients that I work with. And then even a few months ago, I found myself staring at a bonfire and gathered around a fire with a group of folks. And I found myself saying, "Oh, this feels like the original brain spotting." I had my gaze fixated on the fire. The flames were dancing and changing form, and I was really absorbed in the visual of it. And my eyes were fixed on a spot within the fire. And then my brain was also processing through a lot of stuff. I was feeling different feelings. I was in this kind of flow state of consciousness. And so it occurred to me that the things that our ancestors were naturally drawn to do when living in deep connection with nature, like looking up at the stars, looking at the clouds, staring at the horizon, and tracking changes in the weather, in the light, looking into a fire with everyone gathered around. These were maybe some of the original ways that we used that idea of where you look affects how you feel. And so in many ways, I see a brain spotting session as a very structured version of this natural phenomena that so many of us naturally feel drawn to. All right, I'll go ahead and just land here. I'm sure there's more I might be sharing about brain spotting in future episodes, especially as I explore the integration of brain spotting with psychedelic assisted therapies. That is in my next chapter as a practitioner, and I'm really excited about that. But for now, I hope that this explanation was helpful for you and maybe helped you to explore some possibilities beyond or in addition to talk therapy if you're looking for something deeper. And then, as always, you can find links and associated resources in the show notes if you do want to keep deep diving into this. All right, thank you so much for listening. I will be back again soon. Thank you so much for listening to the Nervous System Care and Healing podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. And if you ever have a few minutes to leave a rating and review, it would mean so much to me, and it helps other people to find the podcast and spread the care. Please remember that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy, coaching, or professional mental health services. The information shared here is generalized, it may not reflect every individual nuance, and it should not be interpreted as personalized mental health advice. So please do seek out additional support if you need it. Take care and be well. This is Liz at Nervous System Care and Healing.